slavery was a very common fact in pagan antiquity. As a matter of fact, slaves made inventions unnecessary in Greece and in other cultures. Very often men had the basic premises for inventions that would save labor, but they felt no need to do so. Slaves were cheaper. During the Middle Ages, slavery was abolished in Christendom. The efforts of churchmen led to a steady decrease in the number of slaves and finally their abolition. With the great age of exploration, slavery returned, especially as the Americas were settled and there was an absence of an abundance of labor. Slavery was reintroduced. So we have to recognize that it was the Renaissance and the age of exploration that reintroduced slavery into the Western world. In the last century, slavery was extensively abolished in most of the world, at least in those areas controlled by Christendom. The only country that was not able to abolish it peaceably was the United States, in part because there were those who wanted conflict. However, given that fact of conflict, we must say that while there were serious blunders, it is important to note that a great many Americans, more than a century ago, were ready to die in a war that led to the abolition of slavery. So that we need to respect those who are ready to lay down their lives for such a cause. But all that was abolished in the last century was private ownership of slavery, of slaves, not state ownership. As a matter of fact, the 20th century has the highest percentage of slaves possibly in all of history. Consider the Soviet Union alone, the slave labor camps, the millions that are worked to death there routinely, and this is one of a number of Marxist countries. Moreover, not only do we have slave labor in those countries, but they import slaves. For example, not too long ago, to pay for the cost of military operations and help on the part of the Soviet bloc to Mozambique, 18,000 youngsters were shipped to East Germany to be slave workers. Recently, the report is that 50,000 about the age of 7 were collected and shipped from Angola into Cuba to be trained as perhaps a kind of Janissary movement. Since they are so young, it is believed they will forget their past and be able to serve their Marxist masters. Slavery is thus very much a fact of our modern world. It's something we need to be very careful about, because slavery arises when people forsake freedom for security. And to the extent that a culture prizes security more than freedom, to that extent it will embrace slavery. After all, security is another word for slavery. It's a step in that direction if too much security is sought. The dream of a risk-free life is the dream of slavery, and it is the goal of too many people in our time. We need to recognize that slavery is not a thing of the past, but very much a thing of the present, and perhaps a thing of the very near future. Only if the Son of God make us free are we free indeed, and only as we apply the whole of His law word to every sphere of life can we abolish slavery.
R.E., has slavery been abolished?
I think in form, not in reality. Or in an Orwellian sense, we don't use the word slavery anymore. Yet slavery exists in the Soviet Union and Red China. Debt slavery exists in this country. Throughout history, debt has always been a form of slavery, and the whole country's indebted. So no, it hasn't been abolished. I think we live in one of the greatest slave states in history because we have a global slave state today.
In what way is debt, does debt enslave a person?
Well, when you're in debt, someone else determines how you spend your time, with whom, for how long, where, doing what. How many Americans have bumper stickers on the back of their car that reads, I owe, so off to work I go,
I've seen those.
implying that they'd be doing something else if they weren't in debt and had to work.
I've seen those. I go out in my driveway and look at my bumper and I see
There it
that
is.
bumper sticker there.
In a way, we're all slaves, we're all servants to whatever perspective that we bring to bear on life. And if the perspective that you bring to bear is from the Lord Jesus Christ and through His revelation, you will be the servant, the slave, the brother, the child of God. And that's a whole different type of service and servanthood than what R.E. is talking about. The question is, who will you be a servant to?
Mm-hmm. Otto?
Well, most slaves, or many slaves at least, are voluntary. They want to be taken care of. And that's the compensation for slavery, to be secure. Hitler's appeal was that he would make people secure. The appeal of the New Deal was that we would release you from the fear of starvation and homelessness and so forth. Most people, I hate to say this, but most people come from a long line of slaves and are inclined towards slavery. The slave to fashion is only one aspect, but really they go into debt because they rejoice at the chance to go into debt. I have friends of mine who work in the corporate world they would rather die, and some of them have died, rather than leave the corporation. And it isn't a question of money, because they have enough money to live without the corporation, but without the corporation they feel they have no status in the world, no standing.
So in a sense, security is very common to slavery as opposed to the risk of freedom.
Freedom is expensive. Freedom is risky. Freedom is dangerous. Freedom is a real trial. It costs a lot. It costs in terms of missed opportunities. It costs in terms of friendship. It costs in terms of the world. A free man is detested by every slave that sees him.
And, I've seen that. It seems like when you find someone that's a slave, they look to destroy those to whom they are indebted.
They say, "Who do you think you are?"
Yeah. And that leaves us to two categories of slaves: those that are really as we commonly view as slaves, those that are parasites, but also those who are predators that prey upon others are a form of slavery. Both are vertical in a sense, where God's covenantal and we contract or covenant horizontally, and that's the essence of freedom, is basically not depending on others or preying on others from the top down, but rather contract or covenanting for your needs in this world.
Well, the prey, the beast of prey in human form, generally doesn't get too far. There's an awful lot of them locked up in prisons. These are the men who thought they could live by physically taking the fruits of other men's labor. And recently we've seen in the degradation of our economic system, the degradation of the people involved in Wall Street, for instance. Now, Wall Street has never been a place of saints, but they used to go by the old rule, he who takes what isn't his'n will pay it back or go to prison. Now we have something else that's working in Wall Street, which probably Ivan Boesky's Revelations will discuss. And that is that we've had the equivalent of a Masonic order at work in Wall Street. We've had a group, a collective, that's been transferring information back and forth which is held secret from other people. So we have a rigged market.
Yeah, it's interesting that one of the current Merrill Lynch slogans in the national advertising is that ours should be a world without limits. And of course, we've evidently had a number of people on Wall Street behaving that way, and of course, we all saw them not long ago on the front page of our paper being led off in a big conga line of handcuffs. So obviously they found out that this is a world with limits.
Well, this is a world with limits.
Well, Christian free enterprise has given way to a corrupt form of evolutionary debt capitalism, and that leads to survival of the fittest. and the ability to prey upon other people and take advantage of them. We see that in terms of the number of multinational banks in this country that finance the slave states of the Soviet Union and Communist China, where they basically build factories in those countries and build automobiles and jeeps and photocopy machines and slave labor with American workers' money, ironically.
Well, we have transferred an enormous number of manufacturing facilities outside the United States. We placed them in Taiwan and South Korea.
Mexico.
Along the border, there's nothing but fabricating plants, putting things together, in order to ship them back, use this cheap labor, and then ship these products back into the United States. Of course, that's a short-term business. I mean, you're destroying the economy of the United States when you do it, because you're using American money to build goods outside the United States with cheap labor, and then bringing the goods in at a higher price to sell to the people you deprive of the job.
Which increases the trade deficit, which further enslaves us to foreign capital that has to finance our prolificate waste.
Right.
I'm not finding myself in any disagreement. In fact, these are very helpful comments. But I must have struck a discordant note in my earlier comment, and I think this is important, that if we just use the word slave in a totally negative sense, we're misunderstanding something, that we are the Christians are to be bond slaves of Christ. So there is a type of slavery that is under a just and perfect master who provides a pattern for stewardship. And in fact, the true liberty, and if you will not be a slave to your Creator in that very positive sense of having a father and a master that cares for you and loves you, you'll be a slave to something else.
I would rather use the word child of God. It upsets me to be told that God holds me as a slave, even if He does.
Well, we'll pray about this, Otto.
Well, we are told, if the Son of Man make you free, ye shall be free indeed. That sin is slavery, and Christ sets us free from that slavery.
Right. I don't want to be a slave to my appetites. And that's the slavery that the alcoholic and the drug addict, and for that matter, the crooked financier falls into, because what is the crooked financier but addicted to gluttony?
Well, the neat thing about being under the authority of God is that you get to escape the slavery of nature, because there are no gods that are big enough in nature to prevent man, humanistically, from ultimately establishing himself individually as autonomous or collectively in the state as a god, and which in turn leads to slavery, because the man ends up
Wait a minute.
slave to his own passions, or the state enslaves the serfs under them.
Isn't being a bondservant of Christ the opposite of being a slave to your own appetites, right?
Well, this is what Rush just said.
Okay.
He said you're released from the slavery of sin. And I don't mind performing. I didn't mind. I enjoyed performing my duties when I was a seaman. Everyone on the vessel had a certificate of his proficiency at the level at which he was working. You only had too many able seamen. You had a boatswain, you had oilers, wipers, you had mates and captain and so forth. A master, really, they call him. Well, he was a master. I remember going through this with an elderly seaman one time. We had a dispute with the captain, and disputes do arise. And the captain said, "I'm the master of this vessel." And the seaman said, "Yes, but not the master of the man." Now, you had assigned duties. You knew what your duties were, and you went ahead and you performed them, and you were free within that society. You were not degraded, and the word slave really means degraded, put down, denied the right to complain, told what to do. A Soviet citizen is given his job.
Yeah.
He cannot move. He cannot quit. He cannot transfer. He's told what he's going to get. He's told what he's going to do. And if he doesn't like that, Siberia, and they'll work him to death.
I don't
That's
think
a
anyone's
slave.
arguing that there's greater slavery in the communist states
Yeah.
than there exists in the United States. But Vic's point, I think, if I could get back to it, is that there are multiple levels of slavery. There's this form of spiritual slavery, slavery of the mental attitude, and slavery in terms of God's creation in the material world. And if we're a slave to anything in nature, anything in the natural realm that the natural man's a slave to, ends up being inadequate and puts him into even a greater form of degradation and a lower form of slavery than as a bondservant of the Lord Jesus Christ.
Well, I think really in terms of an army, I always felt that I was drafted on the lowest level, a private in God's army, and but even a private, has some rights, and we have some rights. God lets us go to hell if we insist, and that means that if we have some room to breathe.
Well, I don't want to dwell on this, but I will
Oh,
say,
go ahead.
but I will say this, that our relationship to God is comprehensive, and that's why phrases like child, friend, son, bride, servant, bond, slave, and we need to think in terms of all of those as we relate to God. And I'm convinced that the church today has no sense, in any significant number, of relating to God as a servant. And many of them relate to him as a child, a spoiled child.
Yes, I can see the point you're making, Victor. Most people go to Christ not as Lord, not as absolute sovereign, but as their fire and life insurance agent. And that is very, very wrong.
Any good economist will tell you that where you have a monopoly or a government licensed agency, what you end up with is less goods and services provided, less satisfaction to the consumer. Today in the United States, it's fashionable to think of ourselves as free, where every man does his own thing. And yet, the body of freedom is walked on the legs of law and economics. And so we have effective monopoly in the American Bar Association and the federal courts and the governments, and we're just covered up with legislation. So we're comprehensively wrapped up like a cat in a ball of twine in terms of the laws that are inundate us. In terms of economics, we have a monopoly with the Federal Reserve and the fractional reserve banking system. So in terms of we're crippled in our legs of law and economics. And then we're told how to think with a monopoly in the public school systems. And then also we're controlled in terms of how we feel with a monopoly in the American Medical Association. So they control how we think and feel, as well as our laws and our money system and our economics, and we fashion ourselves as free. It's small wonder that we can have a confluence or a merging with the Soviet Union, because we're not that much different anymore.
But God gives us the power to break these earthly bonds.
Well, no argument there. I'm just talking about we don't realize that we need to break these chains of
we are
slavery.
free to move, and if we do not move, we are held accountable.
Yes, Russ.
If I may shift the discussion a bit to focus on our present worldwide problem of slavery. To begin with, in pagan antiquity, slaves were regularly used, and although the Greco-Roman culture, for example, had the basic ideas for inventions, they did not utilize them, because human beings were cheap and they preferred to have slaves to labor-saving devices. However, with the triumph of Christianity, slavery was step by step abolished in the medieval era. With the Renaissance, however, and the age of exploration and the new lands, slavery was reintroduced, in part because they had so many new lands where they wanted to work and exploit the potentialities of the land as quickly as possible. They reintroduced slavery with a vengeance. In the last century, through the work of a number of men, among them the great Christian leader Wilberforce in England, slavery was abolished throughout the world. However, what was abolished was the private ownership of slaves. And what we are seeing now is state ownership of slaves the world over. We have more people enslaved now than ever before in all of history. But we don't call it slavery because it's the modern power state who owns them, who commands their labors, puts them to work in slave labor camps and the like. But we have, again, a major problem of slavery. And it is important for Christians to recognize that the problem is not going to go away without re-Christianizing each of these various cultures.
That's an interesting point. I hadn't quite thought of it that way. And something that came to mind as you were discussing that is that slavery, where it takes advantage or exploits human beings, also exploits the other half of the economic equation, which is the earth, natural resources. We know there's tremendous ecological damage done in the Soviet Union and also in China. So we find slave states and exploitation of human beings. You also find exploitation of God's good earth.
Yes, slavery has usually done that. It has been very, very hard on the earth. And in slave states, it is usually necessary to abandon the land after a period of time and move to another area, because there isn't the same concern for the natural resources of the earth.
I'm curious, there's three little points in, they're major ones. There's 3 points in history I've heard criticisms about, and they say, 1, the Bible provides for slavery; 2, the feudal ages were slavery; and 3, look at with the slaves of the South of the United States. Now, how do we deal with those from a biblical or Christian perspective, those questions that get raised by the secularists?
Yes, I'd like to answer that. First of all, when you face the fact of what the Bible has to say, it is not slavery proper, but bond service. A person could, if he went into debt, go into bond service to work it off. Foreigners could be enslaved, but it was still not possible to hold them if they choose to walk away. It was illegal to try to return a runaway bond servant. If you mistreated him and made it necessary for him to leave, you lost him. He was to be treated as one of the family. Then, as we move on, we find that slavery as private property is a totally different thing. It was in the pagan world. It was a totally different concept from the biblical, which was properly a bond servant for a stated time. I don't remember the rest of your statement.
Well, the second 2 periods, what was the feudal period, a period of slavery, and then what about slavery in the United States in the 1800s?
Yes, feudalism proper began in the Roman Empire, so that what the subsequent cultures after the fall of Rome inherited was simply something that had been around for quite a while. A great many small farmers, as they found life more and more difficult, traded their lands for security under the emperor on imperial estates. That's where serfdom began. In the Middle Ages, the land they worked became transmitted by fathers to their sons, so that while it was in the name of the Lord, the family inherited it. Little by little, this was diminished and virtually disappeared. Serfdom appeared only in the 17th century in Russia, and it more or less was reestablished in some parts of Europe with the Enlightenment. So serfdom was not a creation of the Middle Ages. It was something they inherited and gradually diminished or abolished.
All right, and the third one was slavery in America, in the South.
At a time when there was slavery in Africa,
All right.
slavery in Latin America, slavery in the Orient. We were not unique. We were the first country and the only country to ever fight a war to eliminate it, and that should be a matter of some dignity and pride. A great many men lost their lives freeing the black people of the United States, and they were not black. Who did it?
Yes, and we must remember that in terms of biblical law, the colonies felt that to receive these people in servitude as slaves was not lawful. The first shiploads of slaves that drifted northward because of storms, they were headed for the West Indies. When they attempted to sell them, they were told they would be purchased for their passage and would work it off as bondservants. Moreover, anyone who became converted among these blacks could seek their freedom by proving they could read the Bible and they were believers. A little later, some men introduced into the legislatures, I believe first in Virginia, the legislation to overthrow the biblical requirement, and then they were kept in servitude permanently. However, even then we must realize that by 1860, 10% of the blacks in the South were free. So we mustn't paint the picture as totally black. There were Christians working, there were Christians who were maintaining a biblical perspective.
We could go farther. We could say that no other race or religion ever eliminated slavery except Christianity. And it eliminated slavery not only here, but in Africa and in all other parts of the world. And the people who were released are the ones that now complain.
Rush,
Strikes me. Oh.
just a minute. Wasn't it also true in the Old South at the time of the Civil War, only 1 out of 13 Southern farmers or plantation owners remained a slave owner?
1 out of 18.
1 out of 18. Very,
Yes.
very few.
Very few. And with the others, slavery was unpopular. They,
Wasn't economically viable.
no. Southerners themselves were writing against slavery.
I think Otto's made a very important point, though. Christianity is the only religion that has led to the deliverance of the slaves. Harry, I know you've been looking at studying the New Age movement and Hinduism and whatnot. And Harry, the great attraction to Hinduism in this country, which has built into it a slave system, because that's what caste system is.
Yes. Staying where you are throughout your life. No hope of advancement. No incentives to produce, to achieve excellence, in search of excellence.
And there are people that want to bring this whole
There's
culture to us.
There's also, in terms of slavery, economic slavery, or debt slavery, a direct correlation between the level of taxation and the degree to which a people are enslaved in a society. I think it was in the Old South, the tax rate was only effectively about 1/12 of the income of the slave. And the Viet Cong only took 30% from their peasants there. In the Middle Ages, about 25%, and even the slave empire of Egypt was 20%.
Well, the argument here is that 34% is a Bennett boon to the wealthy,
Right.
and it isn't enough.
It's a recognition, and in terms of the frame of reference of taxes, we are in fact enslaved economically.
Well, but I thought they were the price we paid for civilization. We're getting higher taxes and less civilization.
I don't think that in terms of what the American people would see as the dignity of man, civilization being submerged by endless number of laws and continually being pecked on by endless number of bureaucrats.
By the way, who said that about taxes? Was that Holmes?
I think it's the price we
Oliver
pay for the
Wendell.
destruction of civilization.
Well, he
when it gets to
probably
this level.
dropped the word. That's probably what he meant to
It
say.
was Oliver Wendell
Was it
Holmes who
Holmes?
said that. And Oliver Wendell Holmes was also the man who said that the purpose of the court was to go in the direction that people approved.
Truth was what? How do you define truth?
Well, what we need to recognize that it is a religious issue. The role of Christianity in rolling back slavery has been the key fact in history, and that we have no future except slavery if we abandon the Christian faith. If the Son make you free, then are we free indeed.
I'm not going to say anything after that except amen and thank all of you.